My favorite thing about the Canon C70 is undoubtedly its versatility. I used the camera to shoot small to high budget commercial campaigns, used it for tons of multicam interview setups, documentaries in over 13 different countries, from -20 degrees on frozen lakes in Switzerland, humid conditions in Mexico, and extreme temperatures in the Nevada desert. On a gimbal as well as handheld. You can use it with anamorphic cine lenses in Super 35 mode, native RF Canon glass, or the full lineup of EF lenses with Canon's own speed booster, giving you the much desired full frame look. To really get the most out of this camera that can adapt to every scenario you throw at it, we need to pair it with the right set of lenses for every situation. So in this video I will go over all the lenses that I use for my Canon C70 with and without the speed booster, and I will explain why I chose certain lenses for different kind of jobs. My name is Damien Cooper and welcome to putting yourself into severe credit card debt. So first of all, let's start with native Canon RF lenses. And I actually don't use any on my Canon C70, and that has different kind of reasons. I talked about this topic in detail in both the Canon C70 still being worth it in 2023 video and when I compared the Canon C70 to the Sony FX6. So I won't get into too much detail here, but to summarize, there just isn't enough lenses for the Canon C70 in the RF lineup yet. We don't have a 35mm 1.4 or 1.2, we also don't have a 24mm, and in general, paired with a Super 35 sensor, I'm just missing any kind of wide angle lenses. The 15-35 and the 28-70 or 24-70 are all amazing lenses, but if you use them without the speed booster, it's just not a focal length that I would use too often because it's just too narrow for the line of work that I do most of the times. If you want more details on this, go watch one or both of the other videos that I just mentioned. So now let's talk about the Super 35 lenses that I use. And I mostly use the Canon C70 with a speed booster, but when I use it with the Super 35 sensor without the speed booster, it is for a reason. And that is because of the great lens choices we have when going Super 35. And that is usually just cine lenses, especially cine zooms. When shooting a run and gun documentary, you want to be flexible, so you opt for zooms instead of prime lenses most of the times. But when you actually do zoom and you don't have a parfocal cine lens, then you have to re-rect the focus and it just looks unprofessional. So here I'm choosing a set of cine lenses that I can use for documentary run and gun work. My absolute favorite, the wide angle of choice, is the Tokina 11-20. This is a very well built cine lens that I've used for a lot of documentary work in the past when we were shooting in Mexico as well as in Las Vegas, and that is the right focal length to get close to your subject when shooting with a shotgun microphone, but still get at least 2 people in frame. I also have the stills version of this lens with autofocus, so if I need to throw my camera on a gimbal and I want to have the same glass to match, then I can just use this one. It's not the greatest lens, it's a little bit on the cheap side, but for a lot of scenarios that actually works well. One of my absolute favorite lenses to use with the Super 35 sensor is the beloved Sigma 18-35 1.8. Not only does it offer a wide aperture, so I can actually counter a lot of situations when there's not enough light out there, but I also got the rehoused cine version that now is parfocal for documentary work. As with the Tokina, I also have its stills version counterpart that also features autofocus, so when I need it to shoot on a gimbal or if I want to have a 2-camera interview setup and I want to have my camera set to autofocus, then this is a good choice too. There is reviews about the Tokina as well as the Sigma Cine rehoused lens on my channel, so go ahead and check those out if you're interested in both of these lenses. The only other time when I use the Canon C70 without the speed booster is when I want to shoot anamorphic. And this has been a headache topic for me for the longest time now, finding the right set of cine anamorphic lenses to pair with the Canon C70. Quite honestly, I haven't found a set of anamorphic lenses to pair with my Canon C70 yet. When I'm shooting anamorphic right now, I do own a set of Super 35 lenses by Suri, and those are the ones that I'm currently using when I want to shoot anamorphic. For the price, they're absolutely amazing. They also have some downsides, but again, right now I think this is one of the best options to pair with the Canon C70 on the Super 35 sensor. And those lenses I use for personal projects, short films, YouTube content. I haven't used any of them on a commercial project yet, but I could see myself using those on commercial projects too. Tomorrow we will shoot a one-take short film with one of these anamorphic lenses, and I'm actually quite curious about the results too. So this is it for all the lenses that I use without the speed booster. So now let's talk about the wide array of lenses that I use when using the speed booster. Like I've already mentioned earlier, about 95% of the times I'm using the Canon C70 with the speed booster, and here I have all kinds of different lenses that I use for different kind of projects. One thing, of course, you can only use EF lenses with the speed booster, so all lenses that I'm mentioning now are EF mount and not RF mount. First things first, let's start with the holy trinity of zoom lenses by Canon itself. Here we have the EF 16-35 2.8L, the 24-70 2.8L version 2, and the 70-200 2.8 version 3, I believe. The 16-35 EF is actually one of my most used lenses with the Canon C70, because this is my go-to lens when I'm shooting on a gimbal and paired with the Canon C70 and the speed booster. The lens gives me a great flexibility with a zoom range from 16mm to 35mm. It is fast enough with a 2.8 aperture for most scenarios, and it's also great with autofocus. And this lens I have used for so many different projects, from short documentaries to commercial clients to my own personal projects, you name it. Because again, this is the lens that is on my gimbal about 85% of the times when I'm shooting with the Canon C70. The 24-70 I don't use that often, especially not for commercial jobs. It's more of a behind the scenes lens for this YouTube channel because it gives me more range than a 16-35, so I can capture some details when run and gun doing behind the scenes for our YouTube projects, but I rarely use it on any kind of commercial work. The 70-200 is probably the lens that I use the least out of all of my lenses, but when I need it, then the 70-200 comes in very clutch for live events, for documentaries where you can't get close to your subject, and then the 70-200 is absolutely amazing. But outside of that, I rarely use it at all. My last Canon lens I currently use, and this is also one of my favorite lenses, although it is somewhat of a specialty lens, is the 100mm macro. And this is such an underrated lens, especially for the price. I use this lens all the time to shoot B-roll of products for this YouTube channel, but I also use it for commercial work, personal work, whenever I need to get really close to my subject. And it could also double as a nice portrait lens. I do have another lens that I really like, but 100mm image stabilized 2.8, it's tech sharp, and again, this is one of my favorite lenses, and for the price tag, you have to have it in your camera bag. Last but not least, let's talk about my most used lenses, and those are the lenses that I use for all of my personal work, all of my commercial work, and these YouTube videos, and that is the Sigma Prime lineup. I currently have the Sigma 35mm 1.4, the 50mm 1.4, and the 85mm 1.4, and this is all the EF Art lens lineup. Those lenses are amazing to work with. They give you a clean and sharp image with a great build quality at a fraction of the price of their Canon counterparts. I mostly bought the Sigma set over the Canon set for their 50mm alone, because the 50mm 1.2 is a really old Canon EF lens and it suffers from a lot of chromatic aberration, its autofocus isn't great, and overall I feel like the Sigma is a better choice than the Canon. And since I didn't want to mix Canon lenses with the Sigma lenses too much, I decided to go for the full set of Sigma lenses. The 35mm is an amazing lens for commercial work, for interview setups, and I'm actually using it right now to shoot this YouTube video. The 50mm is a great lens if you want to capture a little bit more detail, get closer to your subject, and just get this nifty 50 look on a full frame sensor with the Canon Speed Booster. The 85mm I like as a portrait lens, so oftentimes I switch between the 35mm and the 85mm to get an establishing shot, to get to see what's in the frame on a 35mm, and then use the 85mm to punch in and really get those details. The one thing I don't like about the 85mm is its sheer size and weight, because that thing is really big and heavy, and especially when using filters, the 86mm filter thread is a little bit too big for my taste. Speaking of filters, the one complaint that people have about the Sigma lenses is that they are too clinical and too sharp sometimes, because they kind of lack character. And I can definitely see that, and this is why I use them with a quarter mist filter about 90% of the times, and I'm also shooting on a quarter mist filters right now, because it kind of softens up the image a little bit. So in my opinion, with a mist filter and a little bit of grading, you can get really cinematic, soft looking images out of the Sigma lenses too. And speaking of color grading, all the shots that you see in this video are color graded with my custom Canon LUT packs, and they are down in the description below if you want to check them out. So those are all the lenses that I use with my Canon C70 for commercial work, YouTube projects, as well as documentaries. But now let's talk a little bit about focal ranges. I really like some wide-angle shots, especially when filming a documentary. You need to get close to your subjects, but you still want to have the option to have at least 1 or 2 people in frame. For this, as well as for a lot of establishing shots, if you want to show your location and let the viewer know where you are, you need a wide angle. And on the Super 35 sensor, I think that is the perfect range with an 11 to 20mm, and on the speed booster, the 16 to 35 is great too. For these mid shots that are still a little bit wide, so you do get a context of the location, I love my 35mm, and I use this a lot for almost everything. On the Super 35 sensor, the 18 to 35 by Sigma actually cuts right into this range. So those are the focal lengths that I use for these mid shots, where you can still see the subject in frame, but you also get a context of your location. Around 35mm on the Super 35 and 50mm on the full frame should be your focal length for a lot of these normal shots where you do want to have a background separation from your subject, but you don't want to have it too compressed either. This is a focal range that I use a lot for my commercial work, especially when you have one subject in frame or you have 2 people interacting with each other, because you can get these over the shoulder looks and you don't have the person to be too distorted, and you also don't have them too compressed with a longer lens like 100mm for example. The 85mm with a speed booster and around a 50 to 60mm on the Super 35 is a great portrait lens and a lens where you can show detail with a lot of out of focus area and a nice bokeh. This is my go-to focal length for close-up shots in an interview setup or just to capture some details opposing to the 35mm that we used before. If you want to get really close to your subject and you really want to focus on these details, then I love my 100mm on the full frame or an 85mm macro on the Super 35. But quite honestly, even if I were to shoot on the Super 35, I would still use the 100mm by Canon. If you can't get really close to the subject yourself, you need a longer lens. And on the Super 35, this sometimes is around 70mm. I use the 24 to 70 for this on documentary work, because 70mm on a Super 35 sensor is still quite long, but I would prefer the 70 to 200 on a full frame sensor with the speed booster, because it also gives you image stabilization, and especially on these longer lenses, this can be very helpful. So there you have it. Those are all the lenses that I currently use with my Canon C70. And in the near future, I will probably make some changes to this lineup, especially when it comes to shooting anamorphic. And I might actually add some vintage lenses to my portfolio as well. But for now, these are all the lenses that I use for all of my jobs, YouTube content and personal stuff. I hope you liked this overview about all the lenses that I use with my Canon C70. And if you did, then please give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more content about the Canon C70. And since you're already here are 2 more videos for you to choose from about the Canon C70. And I hope to see you on the next one.